words that changed everything. I should have left the building right then and never looked back. Should have grabbed Lily and disappeared into a different city, a different life. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that a bleeding stranger was looking at me like I was the most surprising thing he'd seen in years. And somewhere in my chest, something that had been dormant for a long time flickered to life. Curiosity. Or maybe something more dangerous. Recognition. The man took a step into the office and I took a step back. My fingers found my phone in my pocket, ready to dial 911. He noticed. He held up his uninjured hand in a gesture of peace. Then he spoke and his voice was like whiskey, smooth and burning. He told me he didn't want to scare me. He said he worked late sometimes. He apologized for startling me. Everything about his tone was reasonable, calm, designed to soothe. But his eyes told a different story. They were assessing me, calculating, making decisions I couldn't begin to understand. I found my voice and asked if he needed a hospital. The blood was still spreading across his sleeve, dripping onto that expensive carpet. He glanced down at his arm like he'd forgotten about it. He said it looked worse than it was. He told me he was clumsy, had caught his arm on a filing cabinet corner. We both knew he was lying. I should have left. Should have at least pretended to believe him. Instead, I heard myself offering to get the first aid kit from my cart. I told him that stain would set if we didn't treat it soon. He laughed then. Actually laughed. It was warm and genuine and completely at odds with the blood on his sleeve. He said he'd never met a cleaning person who worried about stains at midnight while standing near a bleeding stranger. I told him I'd never met someone who smiled while actively bleeding. He said we were both full of surprises then. Something shifted in the air. The fear didn't disappear exactly, but it changed shape, became something else. Anticipation maybe. Or recognition of something inevitable. He introduced himself. Just a first name, like we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of a crime scene. Vincent. I gave him mine. Elena. He repeated it slowly like he was tasting the syllables. Then he asked if I was always this brave or just this foolish. I told him I was a single mother with a 7-year-old and 3 jobs. Brave and foolish were the same thing in my world. His expression changed then. Something like respect flickered across his face. He sat down in the leather chair behind the desk, finally acknowledging the injury. He rolled up his sleeve and I got a proper look at the wound. It was clean, straight. A knife cut, not an accident. Deep enough to need stitches. I retrieved my first aid kit, kneeling beside his chair with antiseptic and gauze. My hands shook slightly as I cleaned the wound. Not from fear. From proximity. He smelled like expensive cologne and something metallic. Blood, I realized. As I worked, he watched me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He asked about my daughter. Her name, her age, what she liked to do. I answered carefully, not giving away too much. Lily loved art. She wanted to be a painter when she grew up. She had my eyes and her father's stubborn streak. He asked where her father was. I said gone. 3 years now. Left when the bills got too high and the crying got too loud. He said the man was a fool. I said the man was human. Sometimes humans run from hard things. He disagreed. He said real humans stay. They fight. They protect what's theirs. I finished bandaging his arm, my fingers brushing against his skin. He was warm, solid, very much alive despite the blood loss. I told him he still needed a hospital. Told him I wasn't a doctor. He said he couldn't go to a hospital. Couldn't answer the questions they'd ask. That's when I knew for certain. Whatever had happened here tonight, whatever violence had put that blood on the carpet and that cut on his arm, it wasn't something the police could know about. I should have left. Instead, I asked if he was in danger. Someone was coming after him. He studied me for a long moment. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said the danger had already come and gone. He'd handled it. But there would be more eventually. There always was. I stood up, putting distance between us. I asked what he did. What kind of work required handling danger at midnight in an empty office building? He smiled again, that sad knowing smile. He said he handled problems for people who couldn't handle them themselves. He made sure the city ran smoothly. He kept certain elements in check. I told him that sounded like a very polite way of describing something very illegal. He agreed. He said most polite things were covers for uncomfortable truths. Then he did something unexpected. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside was cash. A lot of it. He held it out to me. I stared at the money, at least $2,000 in $100 bills. Enough to pay my electricity bill, my car payment, and Lily's medical debt with money left over. He said it was for my discretion. For forgetting I'd seen him tonight. For not mentioning the blood to anyone. I told him I didn't take bribes. He said it wasn't a bribe. It was payment for medical services rendered. And for carpet cleaning. That stain was going to be difficult. Despite everything, I almost smiled. But I didn't take the money. I told him I wasn't for sale. Whatever he was involved in, whoever he worked for, I wanted no part of it. He looked at me for a long time. Then he put the money back in the drawer. He said I was either very principled or very naive. I told him I was just trying to survive without compromising what little integrity I had left. He stood up, towering over me. For a moment I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Thought he might hurt me to ensure my silence. Instead he extended his uninjured hand. A handshake. Formal. Respectful. He told me he understood. He said not many people surprised him anymore, but I had. Twice in one night. I shook his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength carefully controlled. This was a man who could break things easily but chose not to. He walked me to the door, told me to finish my shift and go home safely. He said my daughter was lucky to have a mother who worked so hard for her. I left the office with my cleaning cart, my hands still trembling slightly. Behind me I heard the lock click into place. I should have reported it. Should have told my supervisor or called the police. Instead, I cleaned the blood from the carpet with specialized solution I wasn't supposed to use except for emergencies. I erased every trace of violence from that office. And when I left the building at 4 a.m., exhausted and confused, I found an envelope taped to my car windshield. Inside was the money he'd tried to give me. And a note in elegant handwriting. Said for Lily. Every child deserves art supplies. No strings attached. I stood in the empty parking garage, holding $2,000 and a note from a dangerous stranger who'd seen more of me in one conversation than most people saw in years. And I knew with terrible certainty that this wasn't over. I didn't see Vincent again for 3 weeks. I kept the money. I told myself I'd find a way to return it, but Lily's asthma medication cost $600, and the electricity company was threatening disconnection. The money disappeared into survival like water into sand. I bought Lily a small art set with what was left over. Watercolors, brushes, good paper. Her face lit up like Christmas morning. Every night I cleaned the 22nd floor. Every night that corner office was dark and empty, door locked. Like that midnight encounter had been a dream. But the carpet was clean. The bloodstain was gone. Evidence that it had been very, very real. My supervisor, Derek, started giving me problems in week 4. He'd always been difficult. Middle-aged, bitter, the kind of man who found small power intoxicating. He liked to stand too close when giving instructions, liked to criticize work he couldn't do himself. I'd dealt with men like Derek my whole life. I knew how to be invisible, how to deflect, how to survive. But something had changed. Derek was suddenly very interested in my work on the 22nd floor. He showed up one night during my shift, breathing down my neck as I cleaned. He asked pointed questions about that corner office. Asked if I'd seen anything unusual. Asked if anyone had been working late. I lied smoothly. Said the floor was always empty when I arrived. He didn't believe me. The harassment escalated. He started docking my hours for imaginary infractions. Wrote me up for leaving streaks on windows that were spotless. Threatened to fire me for being late even though I'd arrived early. I needed this job. Couldn't afford to lose it. So I kept my head down, worked harder, tried to be invisible again. It worked until the night Derek cornered me in the supply closet. He blocked the doorway, standing too close, invading my space with the confidence of a man who'd never been held accountable for anything. He told me he knew I was hiding something about the 22nd floor. He said if I wanted to keep my job, I needed to be more cooperative. The way he said cooperative made my skin crawl. I tried to push past him. He grabbed my wrist, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He told me to reconsider. Told me he could make my life very difficult. I told him to let go or I'd scream. He laughed. Said no one would hear me. No one cared about cleaning staff. That's when Vincent's voice came from behind him. The words were soft, almost gentle. But the tone underneath was arctic. Vincent asked Derek if there was a problem. Derek spun around, releasing my wrist. His face went pale when he saw who was standing there. Vincent was in another expensive suit, this one charcoal gray. He looked calm, hands in his pockets, completely relaxed. But there was something predatory in his stillness. Derek stammered. Said he was just discussing scheduling with his employee. Said everything was fine. Vincent's eyes flicked to me. To my wrist where Derek's fingers had left red marks. To my face where I was trying very hard not to look terrified. Then Vincent smiled. That same sad smile from 3 weeks ago. Except this time it had teeth. He told Derek they needed to have a conversation. Privately. In the 22nd floor office. Derek tried to refuse. Tried to pull rank, to bluster, to retreat. Vincent's smile never wavered. He said it wasn't a request. They left together, Derek walking ahead like a man heading toward execution. Vincent paused at the closet doorway, looked back at me. He told me to go home. Take the rest of the night off. Full pay. I wanted to argue. Wanted to say I didn't need saving. Wanted to pretend I wasn't grateful. Instead I gathered my things and left. But I didn't go home. I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour, unable to drive away, unable to stop thinking about what was happening on the 22nd floor. Finally, Derek emerged. He walked to his car like a man in shock. His hands shook so badly he dropped his keys twice. When he finally got in his vehicle, I saw him crying. He never said a word to me again. The next night I had a new supervisor. Except this time it had teeth. He told Derek they needed to have a conversation. Privately. In the 22nd floor office. Derek tried to refuse. Tried to pull rank, to bluster, to retreat. Vincent's smile never wavered. He said it wasn't a request. They left together, Derek walking ahead like a man heading toward execution. Vincent paused at the closet doorway, looked back at me. He told me to go home. Take the rest of the night off. Full pay. I wanted to argue. Wanted to say I didn't need saving. Wanted to pretend I wasn't grateful. Instead I gathered my things and left. But I didn't go home. I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour, unable to drive away, unable to stop thinking about what was happening on the 22nd floor. Finally, Derek emerged. He walked to his car like a man in shock. His hands shook so badly he dropped his keys twice. When he finally got in his vehicle, I saw him crying. He never said a word to me again. The next night I had a new supervisor. A woman named Grace who treated me with professional respect and never asked questions about the executive level. And Vincent's office light was on again. I stood outside the door for 5 minutes, cleaning cart abandoned, trying to decide if I should knock. Before I could choose, the door opened. Vincent stood there, no jacket, sleeves rolled up, looking like he'd been working for hours. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He asked if Derek would be a problem anymore. I asked what he did to him. He said he simply explained certain realities. Made clear what would happen if Derek continued his behavior. Showed him evidence of previous complaints from other women that the company had conveniently ignored. I asked if he hurt him. Vincent's expression hardened. He said he didn't hurt people for petty reasons. He educated them. Derek now understood that harassment had consequences. Vincent doubted he'd forget the lesson. I should have been afraid. Should have seen the manipulation, the control, the casual display of power. Instead I felt something terrifying. Relief. And gratitude. And something else I didn't want to name. I thanked him quietly. He said I shouldn't have to thank anyone for basic human decency. Said the fact that I did told him everything about the world I'd been surviving in. Then he invited me in for coffee. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed that crossing that threshold meant crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But my wrist still throbbed where Derek had grabbed it. My daughter was safe with my mother. And this dangerous, mysterious man who'd saved me twice now was looking at me like I mattered. I went inside. The office was warmer than I expected. Softer. There were books on the shelves, real books worn from reading. A photograph on the desk showed a woman with kind eyes and a young boy with Vincent's smile. He saw me looking and explained. His mother. She died when he was 15. The photo was the only thing he'd kept from his childhood. He made coffee in a small kitchen alcove I hadn't noticed before. Real coffee, not the instant kind. The smell filled the space with unexpected comfort. We sat in the leather chairs by the window, the city sprawling below us like a carpet of light. At this height, everything looked peaceful. You couldn't see the violence, the poverty, the desperate survival happening in those streets. He asked about Lily. If she was using the art supplies. I told him she was. Every day after school. She'd painted me a picture of the two of us. I carried it in my wallet. He asked to see it. I showed him. A child's painting, 2 stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. Hearts floating around us. The word familia written in shaky letters across the top. He studied it for a long time. When he handed it back, his eyes were suspiciously bright. He said she had her mother's warmth. That was more valuable than any technical skill. We talked for an hour. About everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in foster care, bouncing between homes that didn't want him. About learning early that the world was divided into predators and prey, and the only way to survive was to become something else entirely. I told him about Lily's father. About being 19 and in love and thinking that was enough. About realizing too late that some people loved the idea of family more than the reality of it. He asked if I ever regretted it. Having Lily so young. Sacrificing my own dreams. I said Lily wasn't a sacrifice. She was the only thing I'd ever done that mattered. Everything else was just survival. He understood. I could see it in his eyes. This man who controlled things from shadows, who handled violence like paperwork, who probably had blood on his hands. He understood loving someone enough to burn your whole life down for them. Eventually I had to ask. I needed to know what I'd walked into, what I was becoming complicit in just by sitting here. I asked what he really did. Who he worked for. Why men like Derek were terrified of him. He considered his answer carefully. Then he told me the truth. He ran the city. Not officially. Not with titles or elections. But every deal that mattered, every problem that needed solving, every piece of the underground economy that kept things functioning, it all went through him or his people. He imported goods. Some legal, some less so. He settled disputes. He protected certain businesses from certain threats. He made sure the violence stayed contained, controlled, didn't spill into civilian lives. I asked if that made him a criminal. He said it made him necessary. The city had an ecosystem. Without people like him managing the darkness, it would consume everything. I told him that was a convenient philosophy for someone profiting from it. He agreed. Said he never claimed to be noble. Just effective. Then he asked what I thought of him now. Now that I knew. I looked at this man who'd given my daughter art supplies. Who'd stopped my harassment without being asked. Who drank coffee with a cleaning woman at midnight like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told him I thought he was dangerous. And probably damned. And that I should run from him as fast as possible. He asked why I wasn't running then. I said I didn't know. Maybe because I was tired of running. Maybe because danger looked different when it protected instead of threatened. Maybe because he was the first person in years who'd seen me as something other than invisible. He reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. His grip was warm, careful, like he was holding something fragile. He told me I could walk away. Right now. Go back to cleaning, to surviving, to the life I'd built. He'd make sure I was protected. Make sure Derek and others like him never bothered me again. No strings. No obligations. Or I could stay. Let him into my life. Accept help that would come with complications I couldn't yet imagine. He said the choice was mine. But once I made it, everything would change. I sat there, hand in his, looking at the city below. Thinking about Lily's medical bills. About working 3 jobs and barely surviving. About being so invisible that men like Derek thought they could corner me in closets. About this stranger who'd seen me when no one else did. I told him I didn't want his money. Didn't want to be kept or saved or turned into some kind of charity case. He asked what I did want. I said I wanted to be seen. To matter. To have someone in my corner who gave a damn if I made it through another day. He squeezed my hand gently. He said I already mattered. More than I knew. He told me about a building he owned. Apartments above a restaurant he used for legitimate business. One unit was empty. 3 bedrooms, safe neighborhood, good schools. I could live there. Lily could have her own room. Real stability. I started to refuse. It was too much. Too fast. He cut me off. He said he wasn't offering charity. The building needed a property manager. Someone to oversee maintenance, handle tenant issues, keep things running smoothly. He'd pay fair wages. The apartment came with the job. It was the perfect cover. A reasonable offer disguised as opportunity. We both knew it was more. I asked what he'd want in return. He said honesty, trust, and for me to let him protect what was his. I asked if that's what I was now. His. He said only if I wanted to be. I should have said no. Should have walked away from this beautiful trap disguised as salvation. That I said yes. And watched his face transform into something tender and fierce and absolutely terrifying. He pulled me to my feet, hands framing my face, and kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It was claiming and desperate and full of everything we hadn't said. I kissed him back with years of loneliness and fear transmuting into want. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. He told me this wouldn't be easy. That his world would touch mine in ways I couldn't predict. That he'd protect me and Lily with everything he had, but that protection came with prices. I told him I'd already paid so many prices just to survive. At least these ones came with benefits. He laughed, and it sounded like relief and joy and terror all mixed together. We stood there in that office while the city slept below, 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, making the most dangerous choice possible. I'd just agreed to let a crime lord into my life. And God help me, I couldn't wait to see what happened next. I gave notice at my other 2 jobs. Vincent insisted I didn't need to work myself to death anymore. The property manager position paid more than all 3 jobs combined. My mother thought I'd lost my mind. She didn't believe in fairy tale rescues. She asked what I was really trading for this apartment, this job, this sudden windfall. I told her the truth. That I met someone. That he had resources and wanted to help. She asked if I loved him. I didn't know how to answer. Love felt too small a word for what I was feeling. Recognition maybe. Inevitability. The sense of having found something I didn't know I'd been searching for. Moving day came too fast. Vincent sent people to help. Professional movers who handled our meager possessions like they were precious. They were respectful, efficient, called me ma'am and made Lily laugh. The apartment was perfect. Hardwood floors, big windows with actual sunlight, a kitchen with appliances that worked. Lily's room had built-in shelves and space for an art corner. My room had a real bed with a mattress that didn't sag. I cried when the movers left. Just sat on the living room floor and sobbed with relief and terror and gratitude I hadn't earned. Vincent found me like that an hour later. He let himself in with his key. He owned the building, had keys to everything. I should have felt violated. Instead, I felt grateful I wasn't alone. He sat beside me on the floor, not touching, just present. He asked if I was okay. I told him I didn't know how to accept good things. Spent so long bracing for disaster that kindness felt like a trap. He said it wasn't a trap. It was what should have been mine all along. Safety, stability, a place to breathe. I asked what he got out of this arrangement. He turned to look at me and his eyes were impossibly soft. He said he got to watch me stop drowning. That was enough. Lily came running in then, excited about her new room, dragging Vincent by the hand to show him where she'd arranged her art supplies. He went willingly, letting my 7-year-old boss him around, admiring her setup with genuine interest. I watched him crouch down to her level, discussing color theory and painting techniques with complete seriousness. This dangerous man who ran the city's underworld, listening to my daughter explain why purple was the best color. Something in my chest cracked open. Later, after Lily was asleep in her new room, Vincent and I sat on the couch with cheap wine and exhaustion. He told me about the building. It was legitimate property, purchased legally, managed through his above-board businesses. The other tenants were real people with real leases. My job was genuine. But it was also strategic. This building was in a neighborhood he controlled. His people could watch, protect, ensure nothing touched us. I asked if I was bait for something. He looked horrified. He said I was never bait. I was what he protected, not what he risked. Then he explained the ecosystem I'd entered. The restaurant downstairs was a front for meetings. The dry cleaner across the street was owned by one of his associates. The bodega on the corner reported to his network. I was living in the center of his world, surrounded by people loyal to him. I asked if I was a prisoner. He said I was the opposite. I was the safest person in the entire city. I asked what happened to people who threatened me. His smile went cold. He said I'd never have to find out because no one would be that stupid. He should have terrified me. This casual acknowledgement of violence, this absolute certainty in his power to protect and destroy. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Secure. He left around midnight, kissing my forehead, telling me to lock the door behind him. Telling me to call if I needed anything. Anything at all. I locked the door and stood in my new apartment, listening to Lily breathe peacefully in the next room, and realized I'd just crossed a line I'd never be able to uncross. I was Vincent's now. Protected, provided for, pulled into an orbit I didn't fully understand. And I was okay with that. The job was real. That surprised me. I spent my first week meeting tenants, organizing maintenance schedules, handling complaints about leaky faucets and noisy neighbors. It was normal. Almost boring. Except for the moments that weren't. Like when a tenant 3 floors down asked if the rent could be paid in cash with no receipts. I said no. Everything went through proper channels. He looked relieved, like I'd passed a test. Or when the restaurant owner downstairs, Maria, brought me coffee and casually mentioned that if I ever needed anything at all, I should ask her first before bothering Vincent. Or when I noticed the same 3 men rotating shifts in the bodega across the street, always watching, always aware. I was being protected. And evaluated. Vincent visited most evenings. Sometimes briefly checking in. Sometimes for dinner, eating pasta with Lily and me like we were a normal family. Sometimes late after Lily was asleep just to talk. We talked about everything. His childhood in the system, my teenage pregnancy, the ways we'd both learned to survive in a world that didn't care if we made it or not. He told me about his mother, how she'd worked 3 jobs like me trying to give him a better life. How she died from an aneurysm at work. Collapsed in a factory and no one had noticed for an hour because she was just another invisible worker. He'd been 15. Went into foster care. Decided that day that he'd never be invisible again. Never be powerless. Never let the people he loved get crushed by a system designed to grind up the poor. I understood then. Why he did what he did. Why power mattered so much. He wasn't cruel. He was terrified. Terrified of being that helpless kid again, unable to save anyone. I told him about Lily's father. About being 19 and pregnant and so sure that love would be enough. About the night he left, taking the rent money, leaving me with a 2-year-old and no prospects. About building a life from nothing because the alternative was giving up. Vincent listened to all of it. Never judged. Never tried to fix things that couldn't be fixed. He just saw me. Really truly saw me. And I started seeing him too. Past the expensive suits and the power. Past the dangerous reputation and the blood I knew was on his hands. I saw a man who'd built himself from ruins. Who protected fiercely because he knew what it meant to have no protection. Who was gentle with my daughter because he remembered what it was like to be a child no one wanted. We kissed more. Slowly. Carefully. Like we were both afraid of breaking something precious. He never pushed for more. Never assumed. Just held me on the couch after Lily was asleep, running his fingers through my hair, content with presence. I'd never been with a man who was content with just holding me. In week 3 I met the others. Marcus showed up one afternoon to fix the building's security system. He was massive, scarred, looked like violence given human form. But he was patient with Lily when she asked a million questions about wires and cameras, explaining everything in simple terms. After she left, he looked at me seriously. Told me Vincent was different now. Softer. More careful. He said that made him vulnerable, and vulnerability got people killed in their world. He asked if I understood what I'd done to Vincent just by existing. I said I was starting to. He nodded. Said he'd been with Vincent for 12 years. Watched him become something cold and efficient and untouchable. Said I was the first crack in that armor, and he wasn't sure if that was good or dangerous. I asked which he hoped it was. He smiled. Said good. Vincent deserved good. Just hoped good didn't get him killed. Then there was Isabella, Vincent's financial manager. She came by to discuss building budgets, all business, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. He studied me like an equation to solve. Asked pointed questions about my background, my intentions, my expectations. I told her I wasn't after Vincent's money. Had no delusions about what this was. He asked what I thought it was. I said it was 2 broken people finding something solid in each other. Temporary maybe. Probably doomed. But real while it lasted. She softened slightly. Said Vincent hadn't brought anyone into his world in 5 years. The last woman had used him, stolen information, nearly gotten him killed. She told me if I hurt him, she'd destroy my life so thoroughly I'd wish I'd never been born. Then she handed me a credit card. Building expenses. Emergency funds. My name on it. She said Vincent trusted me. So she'd try to trust me too. I took the card, feeling the weight of it. Not just plastic and credit. But responsibility. Investment. The tangible proof that I was part of something now. Something bigger and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. That night Vincent came by late. Found me on the fire escape, unable to sleep, watching the city breathe below us. He sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. I asked him what I was to him. Really? He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me the truth. He said I was the first person in 15 years who'd looked at him and seen a human being instead of a weapon or a threat. I'd taken care of his injury without asking for anything. Refused his money. Kept his secrets not out of fear but out of something else entirely. He said I made him remember what it felt like to be seen as something other than dangerous. I told him I saw the danger. Wasn't blind to it. He asked why I stayed then. I turned to look at him, this beautiful, broken man who'd rearranged his entire world to make space for me and my daughter. I said because the danger was honest. Because he'd never pretended to be something he wasn't. Because in a world that had chewed me up and spit me out repeatedly, he was the first person who'd tried to protect me instead of use me. He kissed me then, slow and deep, and it felt like falling and flying simultaneously. We made love for the first time that night on my new bed in my new apartment in the building he owned. He was careful, reverent, like I was something precious he was afraid to break. After, wrapped in sheets and moonlight, he told me he loved me. Just said it simply, like it was a fact, not a confession. I said it back because it was true. I'd fallen in love with him somewhere between midnight coffee and moving day. Somewhere between watching him with my daughter and listening to his stories about being invisible. I loved him. And it terrified me. He held me tighter, face buried in my hair, and I felt him shake slightly. Not from cold. From relief or fear or some emotion too big for his body to contain. We fell asleep like that, tangled together, and for the first time in years I didn't have nightmares about drowning. Vincent wanted to meet my mother properly. Not as my employer or landlord. As the man in my life. I told him that was a terrible idea. My mother was protective, suspicious, and had perfect instincts for danger. He said good. He'd respect a mother who protected her daughter. So I arranged dinner at the apartment. Nothing fancy. Just spaghetti and garlic bread and cheap wine. Lily was excited, setting the table with elaborate care, making place cards with crayon drawings. My mother arrived early, eyes sweeping the apartment with practiced assessment. Taking in the quality of the furniture, the security on the door, the expensive art on the walls. She asked how much this place cost. I told her it came with the job. She asked what the job really was. Vincent arrived before I could answer, carrying flowers for my mother and a new paint set for Lily. He was dressed down, jeans, a simple sweater, trying to look non-threatening. It didn't work. My mother saw exactly what he was within seconds. Dinner was tense. My mother asked pointed questions about Vincent's business, his background, his intentions. He answered honestly, never sugarcoating, treating her with the respect she deserved. Lily chattered through the awkwardness, showing Vincent her new paintings, talking about school, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents. After dinner, my mother asked to speak with me privately. We went to the kitchen while Vincent and Lily did dishes. My mother asked if I knew what I was doing. If I understood what kind of man I'd brought into my daughter's life. I told her I did. Told her everything. About finding him bleeding, about Derek, about the choice I'd made. She asked if I loved him. I said yes. She asked if he loved me. I said yes. And that he loved Lily too. Treated her like she mattered. Was patient and kind and protective. My mother studied me for a long moment. Then she said I looked happier than I'd been in years. More rested. Less afraid. She said she didn't approve. That men like Vincent brought violence into the lives of everyone around them. But she also understood why I'd made this choice. She told me to be careful. To have an exit plan. To never forget that I was a mother first and his woman second. I promised. When we returned to the living room, Vincent was reading to Lily from one of her books, doing silly voices that made her giggle. My mother watched them, face softening despite herself. Before she left, she pulled Vincent aside. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw his face grow serious. Saw him nod with complete understanding. Later, after everyone was gone and Lily was asleep, I asked what my mother said. Vincent smiled that sad smile. He told me she'd explained exactly what would happen to him if I or Lily got hurt because of his world. In graphic detail. I asked if she'd scared him. He said absolutely. Your mother was terrifying in the best possible way. We sat on the couch, my head on his shoulder, his arm around me. He told me about wanting a family. About thinking it was impossible for someone like him. About believing he'd die alone because that's what men in his position did. Then he'd found me. Bleeding and vulnerable and needing help. And I'd helped without hesitation, without knowing who he was, without wanting anything in return. He said I'd changed everything. Made him want things he'd stopped letting himself want. I asked what things. He said this. Quiet evenings. A woman he loved. A child who smiled when he entered a room. The possibility of something beyond survival. I told him I wanted those things too. Had wanted them since Lily's father left. Had almost given up on believing they existed. He kissed me softly. Told me they existed. We were living them right now. I wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe we could have this love and safety and normalcy, despite everything he was. But part of me knew better. Knew that in his world happiness was borrowed time. Violence was always waiting. I just didn't know how soon it would arrive. It started with a simple request. Vincent needed me to accept a package. Someone would deliver it to the building and I needed to hold it in my apartment for a few hours until he could pick it up. He said it was documents. Business paperwork. Nothing dangerous. I asked why it couldn't go to his office. He said his office was being watched. The feds were investigating some of his holdings, looking for anything they could use. This package needed to stay off their radar. I asked if accepting it would make me complicit in something illegal. He said no. The documents were legitimate. He just needed them kept somewhere the feds wouldn't think to look. I hesitated. This was different from living in his building or managing his property. This was actively participating. He saw my uncertainty. He told me I could say no. That he'd understand. That he'd never force me into anything that made me uncomfortable. But I saw the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. This mattered. This was important. I said yes. The package arrived at noon. Plain manila envelope, no markings, delivered by a nervous young man who couldn't meet my eyes. I put it in my bedroom closet as instructed. Tried not to think about it. Lily came home from school full of stories about art class. We made dinner together, normal as breathing. I almost forgot about the envelope. Until the knock came at 8 p.m. Not Vincent. 2 federal agents, badges held high, asking if they could come in. My heart stopped. I thought about the envelope in my closet. About the choice I'd made. About Lily in her bedroom doing homework. I asked if they had a warrant. They said no. Just wanted to ask a few questions about the building. About my employer. I told them I had nothing to say without a lawyer present. They looked surprised. People in my position usually cooperated out of fear or ignorance. They asked if I knew Vincent Morelli. If I understood what kind of man he was. If I knew that helping him could make me an accessory to various crimes. I said I knew Vincent Morelli as my employer and landlord. That he'd been nothing but professional and respectful. They said he was a criminal. That he ran illegal operations. That people who got close to him usually ended up hurt or dead or in prison. I told them that sounded like speculation rather than evidence. They left, but not before warning me that loyalty to men like Vincent Morelli was misplaced and dangerous. After they left, my hands shook so badly I could barely lock the door. Vincent arrived 20 minutes later, let himself in with his key, face dark with fury. He went straight to the envelope, checking my apartment for bugs or tracking devices. He found nothing. Then he turned to me and his rage collapsed into fear. He asked if they'd threatened me. If they'd tried to search. If they'd mentioned Lily. I told him what happened. How I'd refused to let them in. Refused to answer questions. He pulled me into his arms, holding on like I might disappear. He said he was sorry. Said he never should have asked me to hold the package. Said he'd put me in danger for his business and that was unforgivable. I pulled back to look at him. Asked if the envelope contained what he said it did. He said yes. Just documents. Corporate paperwork for a legitimate holding company. Nothing illegal. I believed him. I don't know why, but I did. I told him the feds coming to my door terrified me. Not for myself. For Lily. For what it meant that his world was bleeding into hers. He said he'd fix it. Would make sure they understood I was off limits. Would ensure they never came near me or Lily again. I asked how he'd do that. He said he had lawyers. Resources. Ways of making problems disappear. I asked if that meant violence. He said not this time. The feds couldn't be touched. But they could be managed, redirected, given bigger fish to fry. He left with the envelope, kissing me deeply before he went, promising this would never happen again. I believed that too. I was wrong. 3 days later, Marcus showed up at my door, face grim. He said Vincent needed me. That there was a situation and I was the only person who could help. I asked what kind of situation. He said the kind that required someone the feds wouldn't suspect. Someone clean. Someone Vincent trusted absolutely. I asked what he needed me to do. Marcus told me. And my blood ran cold. Vincent needed me to meet someone. Accept a briefcase. Bring it back to the apartment. Simple handoff. 5 minutes of work. But the briefcase wouldn't contain documents this time. It would contain money. A lot of it. Payment for a shipment that couldn't go through normal channels. I asked if this was drug money. Marcus said no. Art. Stolen art being returned to rightful owners. The buyers paid in cash because banks asked too many questions. I asked if I'd be committing a crime by accepting it. Marcus said technically no. The art transactions were legal. The cash was legitimate earnings. But if the feds traced it back to me, they could make my life very difficult while trying to prove otherwise. I told him I needed to think about it. He said I had 2 hours. Then Vincent would have to use someone else, someone less trustworthy, and the whole operation could collapse. After he left, I sat on my couch, head in my hands, thinking about lines I'd promised myself I wouldn't cross. This was different from accepting a package. This was actively participating in Vincent's operations, becoming part of the infrastructure that kept his empire running. But it was also art repatriation. Returning stolen treasures to where they belonged. Was that really so different from what museums did? And Vincent needed me. Trusted me. Was depending on me. I thought about Lily. About the life Vincent had given us. About the safety and stability and love I'd never thought I'd have. About the price I was willing to pay to keep it. I called Marcus back. I said yes. 2 hours later, I met a nervous man in a coffee shop 3 blocks away. He handed me a briefcase under the table. I walked back to my apartment with $1 million in cash in my hands, praying I wouldn't get stopped. I made it home. Put the briefcase in my closet next to where the envelope had been. Vincent arrived an hour later, retrieved it, and kissed me like I'd saved his life. Maybe I had. That night after he left, I stood in Lily's doorway watching her sleep. So innocent. So unaware of what her mother had become. I'd just committed a felony. Maybe several. And I'd do it again if Vincent asked. That realization terrified me more than anything. The feds came back. Different agents this time. Harder. More informed. They knew about the briefcase. Knew about the meeting. Had photos of me accepting it. They offered me a deal. Testify against Vincent. Tell them everything I knew about his operations. In exchange, immunity for me, protection for Lily, a new life far away from all of this. I told them I didn't know anything. I was just a property manager who occasionally helped her employer with legitimate business tasks. They showed me photos. Vincent meeting with known criminals. Money changing hands. Properties used as fronts. A whole web of operations spanning the city. They said Vincent Morelli was responsible for at least 12 deaths. That he ran gambling, smuggling, money laundering. That he was a monster dressed in expensive suits. They asked if I wanted my daughter growing up around a killer. I asked if they had evidence that would hold up in court. They said they were building a case. With my testimony they'd have enough. Without it, Vincent would walk free and I'd go to prison for money laundering. They gave me 48 hours to decide. After they left, I called Vincent. He came immediately, face pale, when I told him what happened. He said he'd protect me. Would make sure I never faced charges. Had lawyers who could make this disappear. I asked if what they said was true. About the deaths. About the extent of his operations. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me everything. He said yes, he'd killed people. 12 over 15 years. All of them had been trying to kill him or people he protected. All in self-defense by any reasonable definition. But the law didn't care about reasonable when it came to men like him. He ran operations across the city. Gambling, yes. But regulated, controlled, kept away from kids and desperate people. Smuggling, yes. But art and antiquities stolen during wars, being returned home. Money laundering, technically. But cleaning money from legitimate businesses being extorted by worse criminals than him. He said he wasn't noble. Wasn't a hero. But he was better than the alternatives. His territories were safer, his rules were fairer, his violence was contained. I asked why he never told me the full extent before. He said because he wanted me to love him before I knew everything. Wanted to be seen as human before being seen as monster. I asked if he regretted pulling me into his world. He said every single day. Said loving me was the best and worst thing he'd ever done. Best because I made him feel human again. Worst because he'd contaminated something pure with his darkness. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked the question that had been haunting me. I asked about Lily's father. About Carlos. Vincent's face went carefully blank. I said I'd always wondered why Carlos left so suddenly. So completely. Like he was running from something. Vincent didn't answer. I pressed. Asked if he'd had anything to do with Carlos disappearing. He met my eyes. Said yes. My world tilted. he explained. Said 3 years ago he'd been investigating a drug operation. Found out one of the dealers had a baby at home. A partner struggling to raise a child alone while this man gambled away their money and occasionally got violent. Vincent had paid him a visit. Explained that men who abandoned their children weren't men at all. Gave him 2 choices: leave and never come back, or stay and face consequences. Carlos had chosen to leave. Vincent hadn't known until later that the woman was me. The child was Lily. When he figured it out, he'd already been watching me for months, fascinated by the artist who worked multiple jobs and never complained. He said he hadn't manipulated our meeting. Hadn't planned for me to find him bleeding. That had been genuine coincidence. But he'd been watching me long before we met. Had been protecting me from a distance. Had driven away a man I'd loved because he'd deemed Carlos unworthy. I asked if that's what I was to him. A project. Penance for destroying my family. He said no. I was the person who'd made him believe he could be more than what he'd become. But yes, guilt had played a role in the beginning. Guilt for driving Carlos away, for being part of the reason I was struggling alone. I stood up, needing distance. Needy air. I told him he'd taken away my choice. 3 years ago, and again when he'd inserted himself into my life without telling me the truth. He said he knew. Said he was sorry. Said there was no excuse. I asked him to leave. He did, but not before telling me he loved me. That he'd protect me and Lily no matter what I decided. That if I testified against him, he'd go quietly. Wouldn't fight. Would take his punishment because he deserved it for hurting me. After he left, I sat in the dark for hours. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. Our meeting hadn't been fate. It had been the culmination of years of manipulation and guilt and a criminal's twisted attempt at redemption. Carlos hadn't left because he was weak. He'd left because Vincent had threatened him. And I'd fallen in love with the man who'd destroyed my family before putting it back together in his own image. The feds wanted me to testify. To destroy Vincent. To choose justice over love. But what was justice in a world where men like Vincent existed because the system had failed people like his mother? Like me? What was right when the monster had protected me better than the law ever had? I had 48 hours to decide. And I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do. I didn't get 48 hours. The attack came 36 hours later. I was getting Lily ready for bed when I heard it. Glass breaking downstairs, shouts, the distinctive pop of gunfire. My entire body went cold. I grabbed Lily, hand over her mouth to keep her quiet, and pulled her into the bathroom. Locked the door. Called 911 first, then Vincent. He answered on the first ring. I whispered that someone was in the building, that there was shooting, that we were hiding. He told me to stay put. Said he was 5 minutes away. Said Marcus and his team were already en route. More gunfire. Closer now. Someone was coming upstairs. Lily was crying silently, body shaking. I held her tight, one hand on my phone, the other searching desperately for anything that could be used as a weapon. Footsteps in my apartment. Heavy boots. Multiple people. Speaking Russian. My blood froze. This wasn't random. This was targeted. They were looking for something. Or someone. The bathroom door handle rattled. A man's voice said something I didn't understand. Then the door exploded inward. 3 men. Armed. One of them grabbed me, yanking me away from Lily. She screamed, and another man reached for her. I fought. Bit, scratched, kicked like a wild animal. Connected with someone's face, felt cartilage crunch under my knuckles. One of them hit me across the face. Pain exploded, stars blooming in my vision. Through the haze I heard more gunfire. Different this time. Controlled bursts. Then Marcus's voice, calm and professional, telling the Russians to drop their weapons. The man holding me used me as a shield. Dragged me out of the bathroom, gun pressed to my temple. I could see now. My apartment was destroyed. Furniture overturned, glass everywhere. 2 bodies on the floor, Russians not moving. Marcus stood in the doorway with 3 other men. All armed. All focused. Marcus told the Russian to let me go. Said he was surrounded. Said he'd die here if he didn't surrender. The man laughed. Said something in Russian. Pressed the gun harder against my head. I closed my eyes, thinking of Lily hiding in the bathroom, and prayed she wouldn't have to see me die. Then Vincent's voice cut through everything. He said one word. My name. Elena. I opened my eyes. He stood next to Marcus, and I'd never seen him look like that. Face carved from ice. Eyes absolutely empty. A gun in his hand held with professional ease. He spoke to the Russian in fluid Russian. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. Negotiation and threat and absolute certainty. The Russian responded. Still laughing. Vincent's expression never changed. He said something else. Come. Final. Then he shot the man holding me. The shot was precise. Through the shoulder. The Russian's arm went limp, gun dropping. I stumbled forward and Marcus caught me. Vincent crossed the space in 3 strides, grabbed the wounded Russian and did something that made him scream. Then Vincent looked at the other Russians. The ones still alive, still armed, still considering their options. He spoke in English now. Said anyone who moved would die. Anyone who surrendered would live. They had 3 seconds to choose. 2 Russians dropped their weapons immediately. Vincent's men secured them, zip-tying hands, checking for concealed weapons. Only then did Vincent turn to me. The ice in his expression cracked. He crossed to where Marcus held me, taking my face in. His hands checking my injuries with shaking fingers. He asked if Lily was safe. I nodded, unable to speak. He went to the bathroom himself, found Lily huddled behind the toilet and carried her out so gently. He shielded her face against his shoulder so she couldn't see the blood, the bodies, the violence. He handed her to me, then started giving orders. Marcus and his team swept the building. Police sirens were approaching. Vincent made phone calls, his voice crisp and commanding. Within minutes he'd arranged everything. A different apartment in a building across the city. Transport. Security. 44. The police that painted this as a random break-in, wrong place, wrong time. I sat on my destroyed couch, holding Lily, watching him manage crisis with terrifying efficiency. This was who he really was. Not the man who read bedtime stories or made coffee at midnight. This was Vincent Morelli. The man who ran the city, who killed without hesitation when his people were threatened. After the police left, after statements were given and reports were filed, Vincent drove us to the new apartment himself. Marcus followed with a full security team. The new place was smaller but felt like a fortress. Armed men in the hallway. Cameras everywhere. Bulletproof glass. Lily was in shock. I put her to bed, lay next to her until she fell into exhausted sleep. When I came out, Vincent was standing by the window, still wearing blood-spattered clothes, looking out at the city. I walked up behind him. Wrapped my arms around him from behind. Felt him shaking. I told him thank you. For saving us. For being there. He turned in my arms and his face was wrecked. He said this was his fault. That by loving me he'd painted a target on on Lily's back. He said the Russians were rivals trying to hurt him by hurting what he loved. That this would keep happening. That I needed to leave, take Lily, disappear. I asked if that would keep us safe. He said probably not. His enemies knew about me now. Distance wouldn't matter. I asked what would keep us safe. He said nothing. There was no safety in his world. Only managed risk. I told him I wasn't leaving. He started to argue. To list all the reasons why staying was insane. I kissed him. Hard. Desperate. Tasting blood and smoke and fear. When I pulled back, I told him I understood now. Understood what loving him meant. The danger. The violence. The constant threat. And I was choosing to stay anyway. Not because I was naive. Not because I was trapped. But because tonight when hell came to my door, he'd been there. Had saved me and my daughter without hesitation. Had killed for us without remorse. I said, in a world that had always been dangerous for people like me, at least now I had someone who fought back. He said I was insane. I said I was in love. Sometimes they were the same thing. He held me then, face buried in my hair, body shaking with relief or fear or exhaustion. We stood there while the city breathed below us, two people who'd survived another night in a war neither of us had asked for, but both had chosen. And I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back now. We were in this together. For better or worse. Probably worse. But at least we weren't alone anymore. The feds came to the safe house 2 days after the attack. I'd expected it. Almost welcomed it. Time to make a choice I'd been avoiding. They sat across from me in the sterile living room, files spread across the coffee table. Photos of Vincent. His associates. Of crime scenes and money trails and violence documented in clinical detail. They said the attack proved their point. That Vincent's world was too dangerous for a mother and child. That testifying was my only path to real safety. They showed me photos of families in witness protection. New identities. New lives. Safety purchased with testimony. I asked what would happen to Vincent. They said he'd go to prison. Probably for life. His organization would collapse. The city would be safer. I asked if they really believed that. They looked uncomfortable. One of them admitted that someone else would fill the power vacuum. Maybe someone worse. I asked if they had children. They both did. I asked what they'd do if someone had saved their children's lives. If a dangerous man had stood between their babies and violence without hesitation. They said that didn't change the law. That gratitude wasn't a legal defense. I agreed. Said they were right. Vincent was a criminal. He'd broken laws, hurt people, built an empire on activities that shouldn't exist. But he'd also protected my daughter when the law couldn't. When those Russians came through my door, 911 was still minutes away. Vincent's people were there in seconds. I asked them honestly, would they sacrifice someone who'd saved their child's life for abstract justice? They couldn't answer. I told them I wouldn't testify. Wouldn't help them build a case against Vincent. Would accept whatever legal consequences that brought. They said I'd go to prison. Money laundering charges were solid. I said so be it. My mother would take care of Lily. At least my daughter would be alive. They tried other tactics. Threats. Promises. Appeals to my morality. I remained unmoved. Finally they left. But not before warning me that I was making a terrible mistake. That loyalty to men like Vincent Morelli destroyed everyone eventually. Maybe they were right. After they left, Vincent came in from the bedroom where he'd been waiting. His face was unreadable. He asked why I'd refused to testify. I told him the truth. That I'd thought about it seriously. Had spent 2 days weighing options, considering what was right versus what was necessary. I'd concluded that right and necessary weren't always the same thing. In a perfect world, men like Vincent wouldn't need to exist. The law would protect people like me. Justice would be fair and accessible. But we didn't live in that world. We lived in a world where single mothers worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford medicine for their sick children. Where men like Derek harassed women in closets and faced no consequences. Where violence came for the innocent and the police arrived too late. Vincent had built something in that broken system. Imperfect. Violent. Morally complicated. But it had saved my life. Had saved my daughter. I couldn't betray that. Wouldn't testify against the only person who'd ever really protected me. Vincent was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if I understood what I'd just done. That refusing to testify meant I was complicit. That I'd chosen him over everything else. I said yes. I understood completely. He asked if I'd regret it. I said probably. But I'd regret the alternative more. He pulled me into his arms and I felt something wet on my neck. Realized he was crying. This dangerous, powerful man was crying against my shoulder. He said I'd saved him. That he'd been prepared to let me go, to accept whatever came. But I'd chosen him anyway. I told him I hadn't chosen him over Lily. I'd chosen him because of Lily. Because he'd proven he'd die before letting anything happen to her. That was worth more than all the laws and courts and abstract justice in the world. He kissed me then, desperate and grateful and terrified. We made love that night like it might be the last time. Slow and fierce and full of everything we couldn't say. Afterward, lying in the dark, he told me about his plan. The money laundering charges wouldn't stick. His lawyers were already working to prove the briefcase contained legitimate business funds. The feds had no paper trail connecting it to anything illegal. I'd probably face some minor charges. Maybe probation. Maybe community service. But not prison. He was moving operations. Taking everything deeper underground. Making sure anyone associated with him was better protected, better insulated. And he was handling the Russian problem permanently. I didn't ask what that meant. Didn't want to know. I just held him and accepted what we'd become. Two people choosing each other despite every logical reason not to. Love in the ruins. Beauty in the darkness. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't pure. But it was ours. 18 months later. The charges were dropped. Vincent's lawyers had been better than the federal prosecutors. Without my testimony, their case collapsed. I'd faced some fines. Some probation. Some very stern warnings from a judge who clearly thought I was making terrible choices. But I was free. We moved again. A house this time in the suburbs. Good schools for Lily. A yard for her to play in. Armed security. Disguised as normal neighbors. I stopped managing properties. Instead, I went back to school. Social work degree. Helping other single mothers navigate systems designed to destroy them. Vincent funded a nonprofit. Legitimate. Above board. Providing resources for families in crisis. It was his way of atoning. Of building something good from the fortune he'd made in shadows. Lily was 9 now. Thriving. Still painting. Still innocent of most of what had happened that night, protected by careful stories and therapy and love. She adored Vincent. Called him by his first name, not Dad, but the affection was the same. He taught her chess, helped with homework, showed up at every school event. To the outside world we looked normal. A family. Slightly unusual maybe, but functional. No one knew that the man reading bedtime stories ran half the city. That the suburban house had panic rooms and escape routes. That the neighbors were all on Vincent's payroll. My mother visited often. She'd made her peace with Vincent after the attack. Hard to argue with a man who'd killed 2. Protect your grandchild. She told me once that she still didn't approve. Still thought I'd made a dangerous choice. But she understood it. Sometimes survival meant making alliances with darkness. Marcus became Lily's unofficial uncle. Teaching her self-defense when she got older. Making sure she knew how to be safe. In a dangerous world. Isabella managed the non-profit's finances. She and I had become something like friends. Women who understood complicated men and loved them anyway. The city changed around us. Vincent's influence grew more subtle, more sophisticated. Less violence, more strategy. He was becoming what he'd always been underneath. A brilliant man who'd been forced to use his talents in dark places. The Russians who'd attacked us were gone. I never asked how. Didn't want to know. Other threats emerged occasionally. Vincent handled them before they reached us. We lived in a bubble of controlled chaos. Safe because we were protected. Comfortable because we were loved. It wasn't the life I'd imagined at 19, pregnant and terrified. It wasn't the fairy tale I'd stopped believing in after Carlos. But it was something stranger and more complicated. It was real. One evening, cleaning up after dinner, Vincent found me at the sink. Wrapped his arms around me from behind, chin resting on my shoulder. He asked if I was happy. I thought about it honestly. About the compromises I'd made. The lines I'd crossed. The person I'd become. I said yes. Not perfectly happy. Not uncomplicated happy. But happy nonetheless. He asked if I regretted it. Choosing him. Staying. I turned in his arms to face him. This man who'd been bleeding in an office, who'd saved me from Derek, who'd killed to protect my daughter. I told him I regretted nothing. That every choice had led here to this kitchen, this life, this love. That I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. He kissed me softly. Told me I'd saved him more than he'd ever saved me. I disagreed. Said we'd saved each other. That's what love was in our world. Mutual salvation from drowning. Later, after Lily was asleep, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. Vincent's hand in mine, peace settled around us like a blanket. I thought about the girl I'd been. Working 3 jobs, invisible, desperate. About finding a bleeding stranger and making a choice that changed everything. I thought about all the ways this could have gone wrong. All the dangers we'd survived. All the reasons this shouldn't have worked. But it had. Against all odds, against all logic, we'd built something real from circumstances that should have destroyed us. I'd fallen in love with a criminal. Had become complicit in his world. Had chosen him over law, over safety, over every voice that told me to run. And I'd never been happier. That should probably terrify me. Instead, I just held his hand and watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Beautiful and dangerous like everything else in our lives. Perfect.